I'm the moderator for this session with our very distinguished panel. I'm sure we've all gleaned a lot from the earlier speakers this morning about where East Asia stands, where indeed Asia stands on the global road to recovery and the new role that Asia must embrace to have its rightful place at the top table in the new global economic order. I think the events of the past 22 months since the Lehman collapse has showed that it is, as earlier speakers mentioned today, the time, the Asian century. It has come, it is upon us. The crisis has only hastened that time. Some key topics we need to talk about today, which were mentioned by both Dr. Schwab, about private sector investment, private sector reform, about rebalancing economies, which the US President has been pushing very hard. Indeed, many European leaders have been pushing very hard. Talking about how there is more governance at the top table and how East Asia can push that global governance. And it's also about who Asia is. There's this quote from Henry Kissinger many, many years ago who said that when describing Europe, he said, when I call Europe, who do I call? Well, there's now Brussels, obviously, but when you call Asia, who do you call? So that's a topic we're going to look forward to today. We are joined once again by the Vietnamese Prime Minister. Prime Minister, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. And he is joined by our other distinguished panellists on my far right, Surin Pitsuwan, who is the Secretary General of ASEAN. Next to him is Andrei, who is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of VTB Bank, which is a Russian bank which has extensive and growing roots through the Asian region. And on my immediate right, Hemant, Nerurkar, who's the Managing Director of Tata Steel, I think the 6th biggest steel company now in the world, Hemant, and growing, and Indian-based, but again making inroads into this country and into this region. Again, bringing something of an outside perspective, but certainly a business perspective to the development of Asia. I would, though, like to kick off by asking Surin, if I can, to pick up on a point made by the Prime Minister, where he mentioned the need for a more active role by East Asia, by ASEAN, in promoting global governance and Asia's role in pushing that forward. I'd just like, as the Secretary General of ASEAN, for you just to start by explaining what form should this global governance take and how does Asia push it forward?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Schwab, I miss your January World Economic Forum in Davos because it was too cold. I'm glad you brought it to a warmer climate in a capital of ASEAN and East Asia. I think this is in recognition of the rapid growth, of the rising influence that East Asia, including ASEAN, is playing. To me personally, it occurred very vividly at the SM Asia-Europe meeting in Beijing in the Great Hall of the People of China in October 2008. Right after the Lehman debacle. 27 of European leaders, including Mr. Barroso, including Mrs. Merkel, including Mr. Berlusconi and Sarkozy, and Mr. Wen Jiabao was in the chair. Every leader from Europe was asking, please, East Asia, please, Mr. Wen Jiabao, keep it open, keep it functioning, and keep the imports open and pull us out of this depth of the crisis. That was the real shift that I could feel personally, to the point where David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary of the UK, pulled me aside and said, Mr. Secretary General, this is a very, very strange phenomenon. We from the West are now asking in the Great Hall of the People of China for East Asia to help. Now, ever since, in the last 2 years, I think East Asia has shown a sustained growth rate, and thanks to a very, very strong stimulus packages that we have put out, much less than the West, by the way, to no more than 3% of our GDP. But in the West, it's 9% in order to stimulate the package. We have tremendous reserve since the last crisis that we had. So we are able to design our own stimulus packages not to affect our overall macro balance. So the optimism, the note of optimism that you have heard this morning in the opening ceremony, particularly from the chair of ASEAN, Prime Minister of Vietnam, and all the Prime Ministers of ASEAN, that note is very much pervasive here in East Asia. Now, how are we going to project that optimism? Another quote from Henry Kissinger, Andrew, is that East Asia, for economic growth, for innovation, and for development, is 20th century Europe. He said this last century, 30 years ago. But he said as far as institutional buildings and processes, East Asia at that time was still 19th century Europe. I think we are all responding to that question of observation of Henry Kissinger, and that's exactly what we are doing. We are integrating more, we are building institutions, and I have been saying this to our leaders in East Asia, the measure of our success is not in how much we accumulate. And foreign reserves now is 3.8 trillion at the end of 2009 here in East Asia, not including gold. We want to project that confidence onto the world stage, and you have seen the increase of the voice of developing countries, thanks to a country like China, in the World Bank to 47%. The adjustment in the voting ratio since the last 20 years. And in the IMF, also, the role of China is growing, which means the engine of growth in East Asia, which means the rising confidence of East Asia in pulling the world out of this crisis. We have to project this onto the world stage, and that's why the chair of ASEAN is invited to represent ASEAN, to exchange views with the leaders of the G20 in Toronto at the end of this month, because the world would like to hear how ASEAN manages its own economic affairs in the past 3 or 4 decades, to the point where we are now rather sustained and optimistic that we can manage and we can cope. And we are also talking about global institutions that we would be able to participate in, contribute to, building our own. The $120 billion resource pool that the 10 ASEAN countries with China, with Japan, with Korea have created together, and now a monitoring office is being established in Singapore, is certainly one example of a growing confidence, and would like to show to the world that we want to manage our affairs. If we can take care of ourselves, certainly we already contribute to the world. Now, the best thing for that $120 billion pool is not to be able to draw from it, not to really have to draw from it, because we don't want to be in a position where we need help from outside, but at least it is there as an insurance, as a confidence measure. And I'll tell you a story about this growth of optimism and confidence here in Asia. 10 ASEAN countries contribute 20% out of 120 billion. South Korea contributes 20%. It's left for China and Japan to divide of the 60%. And for a long time, the problems between the two countries is who would contribute more. Each would want to contribute more than the other. I think any region would like to have that kind of problem. Problem that big economies would like to help smaller economies and would like to be a part of this growing and sustained growth and influence that we are exercising in the world. So I think the path is rather clear, rather optimistic, as expressed by the leaders this morning. And I think we are doing everything we can to integrate ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6. There is this question that can East Asia cope with the rising responsibility that we have for the world? And that's exactly what we are trying to do. We have this mechanism called ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, We have this mechanism called ASEAN Plus 3. We have a new mechanism called ASEAN Plus 6 or EAS, East Asia Summits. In that highest level of mechanism of East Asia, we are now thinking how to make it more effective, more inclusive, and we are thinking about including the US and including Russia, so that the question of can East Asia cope can be answered, because we have major relevant and powerful players in our mechanism to make sure that East Asia can grow into the future and be responsible and take the global leadership and global role seriously. And that's what East Asia is doing with ASEAN in the driver's seat or in the centrality.
Just a quick follow-up on that. You still, ASEAN though, still recognises that the G20 is and should be the premier forum for taking global economic issues and growth forward.
Well, certainly better than G8. And emerging economies, particularly the major ones like Brazil, like India, like Russia, and like China, the BRIC countries, certainly would have more role and more say in the global governance. And ASEAN has been recognized as a regional institution that could show the world a modality of development, modality of growth that could be beneficial to other countries in other parts of the world. So G20 is a forum that ASEAN has been invited since the crisis. January in London, September in Pittsburgh, and now the chair, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, is going to Toronto, and at the end of the year to South Korea. Okay. We are recognized, and we think it's a more democratic, more inclusive forum for East Asia, for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN to be a part of.
Thank you very much. Andrei, Kostin, Asia, no doubt, has been significantly helped, Asian economic growth, by the stimulus package, not the least of which was about $700 billion from China. That is not going to last forever, obviously. So it comes down to, as was mentioned earlier, private investment, pushing economic growth here. As a banker, as someone who has come from the outside to this region, give us your thoughts on growth in Asia and what it needs to do to be part of that top table.
Thank you very much. I have to say that Russia is not quite outside the region, because, as you know, geographically, Russia part in Asia and part in Europe. And many think that's a very big advantage for Russia. But from the point of view of financial crisis, I think it's a big disadvantage. Because 12 years ago, when we all talk about the Asian financial crisis, we were a part of this. And this crisis didn't very much spread to Europe. When this, in 2008, we became a part of the global crisis in Europe, while this crisis didn't very much affect the Asia. So I think from this point of view, we are part of Asia as well, part of Europe. So we are not very much outside of you, and Russia, of course, have an extremely close relationship with the Asian countries. It is neighboring Asian countries. But if we talk financial side of Asia, of course, we saw a drastic change of this region from the point of view that it's always been the importer of capital, while recently it has become an exporter of capital. And when we talk about the investments, particularly as a result of the crisis, everybody thinks where to get money. And the money can come only from two regions now, the Gulf and the Asia. And I think that's a very important change for Asia. On the other hand, when we now working with the Asian investors, we also see that there's a more and more trend to focus on Asia itself. Probably China has become such a big economy and fast growing that when we come to Singapore or Hong Kong, we heard, why Russia? Why other part of the world? We have just beside China, it's such a big economy, such fast growing, that we'd rather invest there. It's easy, it's simpler, it's more understandable for us. We recently, of course, had a substantial development in in this region from the financial point of view. Though this morning somebody asked me whether this country or that could become a financial hub, I still think that is a bit too ambitious. There's still, of course, leading financial centers like Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore. If you talk about other countries, I think the financial markets are still not developed to the levels when we can talk about the global or integrated markets. Most countries don't have stock markets. Most countries don't have derivative markets. So I think integration in this area is still far away from what we see in Europe and in other parts of the world. And now the other thing, of course, I think the general integration. I have to say that in spite of the definite achievements which ASEAN has over these more than 40 years of existence, if you compare the integration with Europe, for example, when it led to establishment of the single currency, it is still very much behind this kind of integration. If we talk about currency issues, if we talk about liberalization of currency regime among the countries of the region. And it also, particularly the example of Greece, now showed that probably not only in Europe there's companies exist which are too big to fail, but probably Europe itself, the countries are too integrated to fail, that of course the integration, the other countries, or actually the United Europe, had to rescue this country. I don't think that from this point of view we have in Asia this kind of cooperation, this kind of integration. But definitely you ask a question about the prospects and the view on Asia. Of course, Asia is not the market to ignore, not only China. For example, we as a Russian financial group now exist in 5 countries, China, India, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong. So definitely there's a growing market. As I said, there's a market for not only for already export-oriented industry and finance, but I think there's a very big need for further integration.
If you were going, if I can just interrupt for a minute, if you were going to ask for one thing that needs to be speeded up in financial reform in Asia, what would it be, do you think?
I'd like to see more liberal currency regime, of course. And,
exchange rates.
Yeah, exchange, yes. Thank you.
Okay, we'll revisit that one. Hemant, you're a steel man. You've been in the region a long time. You know how things work here. How do you see, or what do you think Asia needs to do to be a leader that it's not doing right now?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the World Economic Forum for giving this opportunity. I must also say that things which we are not doing well or things which we are doing well, there are, let's say, 4 issues. There are many issues which we need to do well, but 4 issues I think which we need to concentrate upon. One is the financial regulation strengthening, because I don't think we can afford to have crises like 2008 or what's happening now in Europe. It keeps on stopping the wheel of the economy, and that's something we need to avoid. The second thing is regarding corporate social responsibility. The third thing is about the talent management, and the fourth thing is about the environment. And let me just elaborate one by one. There are many issues, but I think to my mind, these 4 we need to address quickly. So far as the financial system is concerned, I have mentioned, and we need to have some mechanism, and I am not referring, or I am not even saying that we need to have a very strong government interference, but at least some regulation in terms of liquidity, in terms of how the capital adequacy is there or not. I think we need to have a mechanism by which there is some control. I mean, you can have some sort of an international cooperation by which the best practices can be exchanged, and each country, of course, has to implement it on its own. It's not that you can have a global agenda or a global regulatory mechanism by which you can do this. Coming back to environment and social scrutiny, the issues of climate change, issues of environment, issues of food scarcity, issues of water scarcity, all are facing us, and we need to act on that. There is a need for stricter regulation, that is also quite obvious. But at the same time, what's going to happen is, in Asia especially, the economy is growing, the jobs are getting created, there is a more disposable income, and people are going to consume more. So in immediate future, the carbon footprint is going to go up, and we are going to create some problems. How do we address those? I think a very fast innovation, especially in the energy sector, is a must. Thank you. A fast innovation, especially in the energy sector, is a must. Nuclear power, wind power, solar power, we need to work on that a lot. And also, there is a mindset which we need to develop of a green mindset in each individual. I don't think we are doing enough as an individual to control the emissions, whatever one can do. I think these are the two things on environment I'll certainly look at. Coming to the talent management, I think again, with the growth of economy and declining birth rates, we seem to have a shortage of talent. And we haven't done enough to improve that situation. What we need to do quickly is to 3-4 actions one can take. One is that between the business, government, and the universities, we need to have a renewed thrust for improving the situation. The second action we need to take is give opportunities to the people at the younger age so that they can fail, they can do anything they want. But I think we need to do that quickly. And lastly, I think we have to, as a corporations, not only treat ourselves as big corporation or a big government, any partner, joint venture partner, supplier, anybody, you must try to educate or try to improve the training of the people as early as possible. I think these are the actions I'll take there. Coming back to the corporate social responsibility, I think, as our Prime Minister puts it, the real word is inclusive growth. And many times I find that while we say this word, the practice of it is not being done so well. As the economy is growing, you will find that the gap between the nations is definitely narrowing. But what is happening is, within the nation, the gap between the rich and poor is widening. And that leads to some sort of a lack of confidence in the minds of the poor people about the growth of the economy or the current growth, what is happening. Anyone who owns the land doesn't really want to give up the land because he feels that that is the only thing I have to hold on to. And that confidence we have to somehow give to the people that yes, the education, healthcare, livelihood is something which will be better when the industrialization and urbanization takes place. I think it's more has to be done by action than by words. And that's where I think one of the philosophy of the founder of our group or the current chairman is that you need to do work for the society where you serve. So whatever is the purpose of the industry is exactly that. And that's what we need to practice well. So these are the 4 things and just want to have one quote for everybody. And this was something which I found this is from the economist David Landis in his survey of wealth and poverty of nations. And about the wealthy nations, it says that they have it not because they are always right, but because they are positive. Even when they are wrong, they are positive. And that is the way achievement, correction, improvement, and success.
Positivity. Just pick up on something you said, because all our distinguished guests this morning, prime ministers, spoke about the need to take action on climate change specifically. And you talk about environmental awareness. Do you see governments leading by example, or are we still in a space where there's a lot of talk about it, but not enough action?
No, I think there is
sorry, I'm just talking specifically in this region.
Yeah. Very specific consciousness on parts of the government, the awareness that yes, we need to do something quickly and the regulations need to become stricter day by day. That I don't think there is any doubt in anybody's mind. How much one does, in what time, and what resources put in is really the question. I think the governments have realized it very well that there is no other choice but to do it correctly well. Business has realized that.
What is the responsibility of business? Do they have to wait for the regulatory framework? Or?
Sorry?
The responsibility of businesses in environmental issues, should they wait for the right regulatory framework, or should they be doing best practices on environmental issues anyway?
No, you just can't wait for anything, because even if you wait for your own country to, if there are no regulations or anything, whatever it is, if you are a global citizen, if you are serving customers world over, if you have employees world over, everybody is going to demand that you take lots of proactive actions. So I don't think there is any choice for any business to wait for some regulations to come in. You see the best practices, you see the trends world over, and if you don't adopt it, you will fall behind.
Surin, you have a...
Yes, this is an extremely important point. Even though governments have to balance between the responsibility of continuing growth, because that, to many governments, that's an issue of legitimacy. You have to keep growth going. So you have to keep the employment grow. But the business sector has to, because we are integrated more with the global community, the business sector has to respond to the standards and the expectation of the consumers out there in the world market. If we don't take care of our environment, for example, fishery and shrimp production, agriculture in Southeast Asia are more and more complying to the global standards. Otherwise, you can't send products to Europe. Otherwise, you can't send products to America. If we are still dependent on the export markets, the standards of the world will certainly be extremely important to all of us. And the private sector is more and more complying to that.
I'd like to move on and ask the Prime Minister a topic which has received a lot of publicity. It is an issue that the US President brought up when he came to the APEC meeting in Singapore last year, and it's all about rebalancing the Asian economy to be more domestic consumption, less reliant on exports. This is something we hear time and again about, this rebalancing. Vietnam, since the open door policy, has become a very successful, fast-growing economy based largely, or at least importantly, on exports. At your stage in your country's economic developments, is it realistic to think that you can move away from your reliance or a reliance on exports? Or does that come later once the more groundwork has been laid?
Tôi cho rằng nền kinh tế thế giới ngày nay là một thị trường toàn cầu hóa. Nền kinh tế thế giới là một cái xu thế tất yếu không thể cưỡng lại được. Vì vậy đó mà mỗi quốc gia vừa dựa vào thị trường trong nước, nhưng mà đồng thời cũng là phải hướng về xuất khẩu. Đó là một cái tất yếu trong một cái điều kiện toàn cầu hóa của nền kinh tế thế giới. Tuy nhiên, mỗi quốc gia cũng tùy theo cái điều kiện cụ thể của mình mà lựa chọn điều kiện cụ thể của mình về cái lợi thế của mình, mà có thể là vừa hướng về xuất khẩu để phát huy cái lợi thế của mình, và đồng thời cũng mở rộng cái thị trường trong nước để cái sự phát triển đó nó được cân bằng hơn, bền vững hơn, hiệu quả hơn. Đương nhiên, cái việc hướng về xuất khẩu của các quốc gia cũng là một, từ cái lợi thế của mình hướng về xuất khẩu cũng là một cái đóng góp quan trọng của sự phát triển của nền kinh tế thế giới. Ví dụ như Việt Nam chúng tôi, Việt Nam chúng tôi là một quốc gia xuất khẩu gạo đứng thứ 2 trên thế giới. đó là một cái lợi thế của Việt Nam. Chúng tôi vừa đảm bảo cái an ninh lương thực cho đất nước chúng tôi, nhưng mà đồng thời chúng tôi cũng phải xuất khẩu cái cái gạo, số lượng gạo mà chúng tôi nhân dân chúng tôi làm ra được, nền kinh tế chúng tôi làm ra được. Điều đó không có nghĩa là nền kinh tế Việt Nam hướng về xuất khẩu, mà cái hướng về xuất khẩu đó, cái xuất khẩu đó cũng là một cái lợi thế chúng tôi, cũng là một cái đóng góp rất quan trọng vào sự an ninh lương thực của thế giới, đóng góp vào cái phát triển bền vững của nền kinh tế thế giới. Tôi cho rằng nên nhìn nhận cái việc hướng về xuất khẩu và phát triển thị trường trong nước một cách rất là thực tế, một cách rất là biện chứng, thì như thế nó sẽ đem lại một cái hiệu quả trong cái điều kiện cái toàn cầu hóa. Cảm ơn ngài.
On that point, Prime Minister, thank you. On that point, what are you doing? What is your government doing, though, to boost domestic demand?
Việt Nam chúng tôi là một cái quốc gia, một nước hiện nay đó là chúng tôi có 87 triệu người dân. Dân số Việt Nam hiện nay là 87 triệu. Mỗi năm thì chúng tôi tăng thêm khoảng 1,1 triệu. Thì trong tương lai không xa chúng tôi là 100 triệu dân. 100 triệu dân. Để phát triển, tăng được cái nhu cầu nội địa, tăng được cái sức mua nội địa, cái mở rộng thị trường trong nước. Cái điều quan trọng là Việt Nam phải duy trì cho được cái tốc độ tăng trưởng. Việt Nam mà phải duy trì được tốc độ tăng trưởng cao, bền vững. Ví như trong năm 2009 là năm khó khăn nhất, chúng tôi vẫn duy trì được tốc độ tăng trưởng 5,3%. Năm 2010 này, chúng tôi có khả năng tăng trưởng 6,5 đến 7%. Và từ 2011 đến 2020, theo tính toán của chúng tôi thì nền kinh tế Việt Nam sẽ tăng trưởng bình quân khoảng 7 đến 8%. Đây là yếu tố rất quyết định để mở rộng thị trường trong nước Việt Nam. Hay nói cách khác là chỉ có tăng trưởng cao, đời sống nhân dân được cải thiện, cái thu nhập người dân được cải thiện, tăng thêm, thì thị trường trong nước mới được mở rộng. Việc mở rộng thị trường trong nước luôn luôn đi liền với cái việc tăng trưởng của nền kinh tế. Và quá trình tăng trưởng đó thì đó là chúng tôi cũng đi liền với cái tăng trưởng đó, thì chúng tôi thực hiện cái tiến bộ công bằng xã hội, cái xóa đói giảm nghèo, để khoảng cách giữa cái số người thu nhập cao nhất với số người thu nhập thấp nhất không quá cách xa. Điều đó cũng vừa là mở rộng thị trường, tăng sức mua trong nước, nhưng mà đồng thời cũng là cái bảo đảm cái an sinh xã hội, bảo đảm ổn định chính trị xã hội. Song song đó thì tôi cũng có thể nói với các bạn rằng muốn mở rộng thị trường trong nước thì cũng không thể đơn thuần là chỉ tăng trưởng kinh tế rồi mở rộng thị trường trong nước, tăng sức mua trong nước, mà phải đi liền với cái việc mà phải đẩy mạnh cái xuất khẩu, từ tiềm năng lợi thế của mình để đẩy mạnh cái xuất khẩu. Điều đó, qua đẩy mạnh cái xuất khẩu đó, điều đó cũng có nghĩa là nó gắn chặt với cái việc phát triển thị trường trong nước. Thì quá trình đó nó sẽ từng bước cân bằng dần giữa đẩy mạnh xuất khẩu và phát triển thị trường trong nước, để có một cái cơ cấu, một cái mô hình phát triển, bền vững hơn. Nhân đây tôi muốn trao đổi với các bạn rằng là trong cái điều kiện thế giới ngày nay thì trên thế giới đều thừa nhận rằng là châu Á trên thực tế là một trụ cột của nền kinh tế thế giới. Trong cuộc khủng hoảng vừa qua, châu Á trụ được, đứng vững được và phục hồi nhanh là một đóng góp rất quan trọng vào cái phục hồi của nền kinh tế thế giới. Vì vậy đó mà châu Á phải tiếp tục giữ được cái vai trò của mình là trước hết là cái phục hồi tăng trưởng nhanh và cái tính năng động của nền kinh tế châu Á. Trong đó thì đi liền với cái phục hồi, cái tốc độ tăng trưởng của châu Á, thì châu Á cũng phải tái cấu trúc lại, cơ cấu lại để có một mô hình phát triển đồng đều hơn, cân bằng hơn, bền vững hơn, xanh hơn, chất lượng hiệu quả hơn. Điều đó sẽ đóng góp thiết thực vào cái phát triển bền vững của thế giới.
Thank you. Surin, Pitsuwan, the Asia are a pillar of the global economy, but having said that, is it not true that there is an imbalance? It does have to be rectified, that it's still too reliant on exports. There isn't enough imports coming in here to get this holy grail of sustainable growth. So what has to happen here? What has to happen in Asia? Andrei, I'll come to you in a minute. Just Surin, first of all.
Yes. Andrew, the effort to create regional market has been going on since since 1992, when we decided to have our own FTA, ASEAN FTA, AFTA. The growth last year in Asia, in East Asia, was 6.6%. 2% of that growth was as a result of our stimulus packages all across the region. But that cannot be sustained. By next year, we will have to come up with our own sustained growth model, and that's exactly what the 10 countries of ASEAN are working on, and that is more integration, better coordination, more connectivity among ourselves. I can give you very, very interesting statistics. Intra-ASEAN trade more than triple from 123.7 billion, 19% of our combined GDP in 1995, to 458.1 billion in 2008, 30% of our combined GDP. ASEAN trade among ourselves has increased phenomenally. Now, of course, it's not enough. I understand that there is a study from the World Economic Forum that we have not integrated enough, that we have not opened enough for each other, but that's exactly what we are working on in the Blueprint for Economic Community. So we are working on connectivity, we are working on the border trade, we are working on immigration, we are working on customs procedure.
And what about exchange rates?
Well, I mean, certainly there is now an attempt to coordinate also in the monetary policy, in the fiscal policy, not at the level of the European Union. But talking about single currency, I don't think the Eurozone is a good example for us at this point.
No, but what about freely floating currencies? Obviously,
in ASEAN, it's very much free. You are talking about some other economies in East Asia,
yeah.
but that's, you know, a strategy that each government has to adopt in order to ensure its own stability inside.
But it is a major friction point.
It is. I understand that, but
and doesn't ASEAN have a responsibility to push?
We do have responsibility. We do have responsibility, but we also have this need to balance within our own group. Not to, you know, to be too engaged, too involved in the internal affairs of others. But overall, I think we are moving in the right direction. And as I said, the measure of our success is not how much we accumulate, not how much we export even, but how much we contribute to the stability of the region and to the global governance. And that's what we are working on. Okay. I have one more issue on this one. You asked whether we can do shift from dependence on export to domestic markets. In some countries, this is a challenge because you want to turn consumers, you want to turn workers into consumers. And that will be a challenge because when you are consumers, you want choices. You have your own tastes. You have your own priorities. when you are workers in factories, you are given the salary as designed, as decided by the management. Now, if you want them to be consumers, there will be consequences, there will be impact on governance as a whole. I don't know if all of us are ready for that kind. So it's a challenge. It's a direction that we want to go, but we have to be careful. That's why it has to be incremental. That's why it has to be a step-by-step process.
Andrei. Following my colleague, I have to say that unless there's a shift, I think the success of this growth for Asia is very much in danger. Because the old model, when everybody wanted to manufacture in Singapore and Malaysia and to sell to Europe or America, will not work probably this time. And we definitely, everybody now wants to sell to China, everybody wants to sell to India. And I think the growth of domestic consumption is vital, absolutely vital for the success of the economic growth in Asia. And Mr. Prime Minister mentioned already that one of the elements of this domestic growth is the growth of wealth of people, income of people. But I would like also to touch a subject of public spendings. I think to a very big extent, the consumption growth in Asian countries dependent or will depend on spending, particularly on infrastructure of government money. We saw it in China at a very big extent. We see it in Vietnam. I think more and more India started to spend. I think it's a very important issue which will boost the consumption. The model which probably doesn't very much work in Europe or in America just showed its effectiveness in Asia. And I think that's a very important element of the domestic consumption as well to the growth of income of population, of growing population, of course.
Hemant, if I could bring you in. One figure which struck me was the Asia Development Bank estimates that infrastructure spending in Asia over the next 10 years needs to be around about $8 trillion. Do you get a sense that there is enough infrastructure? Do governments focus enough on infrastructure? Because again, infrastructure spending is a great way for promoting economic growth and domestic consumption.
I don't think there is any choice but to grow the infrastructure, at least in the Asian region as well as in India. In fact, most of the time, at least in India, what we find is that the infrastructure growth has lagged behind the country's progress. If you look at the airports in India, for example, overcrowded. The roads are overcrowded. So there is a need to improve the infrastructure quickly and fast.
Could you just explain, because India is rapidly is accumulating wealth, shall we say, but there is and remains infrastructure bottlenecks. We've been talking about it I've been talking about it since I've been in Asia for 15 years. It's getting better, but why is it taking so long? Is it politics? Is this welcome to democracy?
I think to start with, I must say that it was every time it was only the PSUs which were trying to do everything. And if you see the current investments in the airports, once it was privatized, yes, we have had some pains to start with, but after that, the progress has been very good. And if you now see the airports, the speed with which they are being built is quite good. Same is the case with the highways. So gradually, I think there is a realization in the political circles that yes, you give it to the, rather than the government trying to do everything, as long as you give it to the private sector, who does it responsibly, I think the speed of progress has certainly improved. Same is the case in airports, roads. What's lacking behind, and which is where there are environmental and political issues in a bigger way, is in ports. And that is something where we need to actually solve some of the environmental problems quickly to improve the infrastructure in ports, especially on the eastern side of the country. Western side, things have happened, but not so much on the eastern side.
I'd just like to take this moment to point out that I will be asking 4 questions from the floor in a few minutes from now. So if you do have any points you'd like to make, if you could perhaps start formulating them, and we'll try and get in as many as we can. Just before we do that, looking at incentivising private sector investment across the region, what's lacking?
I think first of all, the confidence in the private sector that they can do things and the openness with which things can happen needs to change. And let me explain what I mean by this. When, for example, in India, the airports were privatized, we still have some airports which are still being done by the government agencies. Now, why it needs to happen that way, one cannot really answer it well. What we need to do is, once we have chosen a direction, we need to go full hog into that. I think that's something we have to follow.
Any other members of the panel like to comment on that?
We are working here, the buzzword in ASEAN is connectivity, because integration is not going to take place if you can't ship your merchandise from one point to another. A study has been made to ship car parts, automobile parts, from Bangkok to Hanoi, through Laos, through Cambodia. The cost would be reduced by 30% if you have a better custom procedure and better immigration services and better transport. Now, we are working not only within the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, and mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia would have different challenges. But we are working with the neighboring and major economies, with China, with India, with Japan, and with Korea, and with Australia. I'll give you an example. South India, to develop its own automobile industry, will need a great deal of support industry in the form of auto parts. Now, in Southeast Asia, we are very, very advanced in that. In many, many countries, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Singapore, there has been this study that if we can create the connectivity through the shipping lines from Southeast Asia to South India, it will be better than for India to develop its own part industries. It will be quicker and faster, and that's exactly what we're working on. We call it Southeast Asia and South India corridor. The connectivity is a big issue. ASEAN ministers of finance have decided to set up what they call infrastructure fund, with the ADB helping in the management of it, in the raising of the capital, and they will start with government projects, and later on they will start with what you are asking, the public-private partnership model, and that is to invite the private sectors to come in and participate in these infrastructure projects, and that is coming.
Okay. Andrei.
Of course, it varies from country to country, but in general, I would say that there's still too big a role of the government and direct management of the economy. So a lot of depends on how good access you have to the government, how quickly you can get the government decision, and definitely that creates slow down the process of developing a business.
Prime Minister.
Tôi cho rằng vấn đề hạ tầng, tôi cho rằng là vấn đề hạ tầng như các bạn vừa nêu là có ý nghĩa rất quyết định cho sự phát triển nhanh, bền vững của mỗi quốc gia cũng như cho cả khu vực. Nhưng mà vấn đề chúng ta phải giải quyết được hai vấn đề. Một là nguồn lực từ đâu? Lấy nguồn lực từ đâu để đầu tư nhanh cái hạ tầng? Thì tôi cho rằng là nguồn lực thì phải là từ nguồn lực của từng chính phủ, của từng quốc gia, rồi nguồn lực của tư nhân, của doanh nghiệp và nguồn lực tài trợ, hỗ trợ của các cái cộng đồng quốc tế, trong đó có các cái định chế tài chính quốc tế. Vì vậy đó mà để cái huy động được nguồn lực này thì vấn đề rất quan trọng là mỗi quốc gia phải có xử lý được một cái thể chế, một cơ chế mà huy động được các nguồn lực này. Đó là cơ chế công tư, BBB, hay là cơ chế là khuyến khích cái đầu tư tư nhân, rồi cái cơ chế để tiếp cận được cái nguồn vốn của các cái định chế tài chính quốc tế như là World Bank hay là ADB. Thì chỉ khi nào chúng ta huy động được cái nguồn lực tổng hợp này thì chúng ta mới có thể phát triển nhanh cái hạ tầng để phục vụ cho phát triển bền vững. Còn nếu như chỉ xem vào nguồn lực của một chính phủ, một quốc gia mà trong điều kiện cái nền kinh tế đang phát triển còn thấp thì khó có thể có nguồn lực để phát triển nhanh cái hạ tầng. Ví dụ như Việt Nam chúng tôi bây giờ đó là thu nhập bình quân đầu người mới hơn 1.000 đô la Mỹ. Chúng tôi huy động vào ngân sách bằng thuế, phí thì chỉ được 20% tổng GDP của quốc gia. Nghĩa là thu nhập của Việt Nam đến năm nay có 100 tỷ đô la GDP. Chúng tôi huy động vào ngân sách cũng được khoảng 20 tỷ đô la là tối đa. Thì trong 20 tỷ đó chúng tôi phải chi cho tất cả các thứ. Thì không thể dành được cái nguồn lực nhiều cho đầu tư vào hạ tầng. Đòi hỏi phải huy động cái tư nhân, doanh nghiệp cả trong nước và ngoài nước để đầu tư vào hạ tầng. Như là cơ chế BBB rồi cơ chế BOT vân vân. Ngoài ra Việt Nam cũng phải nhờ vào cái nguồn lực tài trợ của các quốc gia theo cái con đường là viện trợ ODA của các quốc gia song phương và qua các định chế tài chính quốc tế như là World Bank, như là ADB thì có thể mới có khả năng phát triển nhanh cái hạ tầng, mà là một cái khâu có thể nói là quyết định cho sự phát triển nhanh bền vững của Việt Nam cũng như của ASEAN cũng như cả khu vực.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd like to open it up to the floor, if I could. If you do have a question, could you just state your name? There's a gentleman over here. His hand's just, yeah. If you could state your name and the company you're with. Thank you.
Alo, tôi là Đặng Lê Nguyên Vũ, Chủ tịch công ty cà phê Trung Nguyên. Tôi xin có cái bổ sung thêm về những cái luận điểm là vai trò của châu Á trong cái bối cảnh mà thế giới mới. Thì thực tế mà nói thì quan điểm của tôi là chúng ta cũng thấy rằng như thế này, chúng ta đang chứng kiến một cái 5 cái khủng hoảng đan xen mà nó đòi hỏi chúng ta phải buộc phải tư duy và thiết kế xây dựng lại đúng giống như diễn đàn mà ở Thụy Sĩ vừa đặt ra. Cũng giống như hồi trước năm 2008 thì ngài Truman Nobel kinh tế có đến đây về diễn thuyết, thì tôi có hỏi với ngài ấy rằng là theo ngài khủng hoảng của kinh tế vừa rồi, tài chính vừa rồi là cần phải kiểm soát hay là cần phải thiết kế lại, thì ngài ấy bảo rằng kiểm soát. Tôi thì tôi không tán thành cái ý này, bởi vì chúng ta đang chứng kiến một cái khủng hoảng mà có thể nói rằng đầu tiên chúng ta thấy là cái khủng hoảng về biến đổi khí hậu là cái lo lắng nhất. Cái khủng hoảng về an ninh lương thực, khủng hoảng về năng lượng và khủng hoảng về kinh tế tài chính thì chúng ta luôn luôn nói tới. Và nhất là cái khủng hoảng cuối cùng là cái khủng hoảng về giá trị, khủng hoảng về nhân văn mà chúng ta đang đối diện. Ở đây nó nói lên cái gì? Nó nói rằng là cái triết lý phát triển của chúng ta hiện nay đang có vấn đề. Hồi trước đây là cái triết lý của nền kinh tế phương Tây là lấy con người làm chủ thể và cộng thêm với tất cả những cái gọi là trợ giúp của khoa học kỹ thuật, và chúng ta tạo ra quá nhiều thứ. Và hiện nay thì với vai trò của châu Á như thế này, trước đây đó châu Á là trung tâm dân số, vì hiện nay là bắt đầu là trung tâm kinh tế, và tiến tới chắc chắn sẽ có tiếng nói về chính trị của trong cái đời sống kinh tế toàn cầu. Vậy thì cái sự mà phát triển của châu Á không thể có thể nói rằng chúng ta phải nghĩ lại về cái triết lý phát triển, tức là nên lấy cái triết lý phát triển là đặt cái môi trường, đặt cái vũ trụ làm trung tâm để mình có thể rằng là xử lý lại ở trong cái mối quan hệ mà có thể nói rằng chúng ta nãy giờ chúng ta đặt ra làm 5 cuộc khủng hoảng này.
Thank you very much, sir. Putting the environment at the centre, I think all the speakers have made it abundantly clear today that the environment does remain front and centre in economic development going forward. There's a hand up over here, the gentleman with the check shirt on. I'm sorry, I can't. You're a little bit. Yes, sir.
My name is Omura. I'm from Japan, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Actually, I agreed with almost all comments made by panelists. But I would rather address concrete answer to your question. One is, the Prime Minister mentioned that Asian economy's achievement to show this world is full of dynamism and changing circumstance is important. And also, as Mr. Pitsuwan mentioned, Japan, together with China and Korea, supported such initiative. Then, concrete answer to your question about the domestic demand and international world. As Mr. Kostin mentioned, currently consumption, like emerging countries, is very important. So almost all countries need to change business model to cope with rising income standard of emerging economies. So our bank want to strengthen such initiative by two-step, so-called two-steps loan by utilizing banking network, local banks. This is one factor. The other factor is to address international issues like climate change is very important. But then they need to cost to finance that. So our bank is established so-called green initiative by providing loans, such initiative in environment and energy consumption. So if these mechanisms would be utilized fully, I would appreciate very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, basically offering incentives for green development.
Yes,
Surin?
Andrew, the JBIC has been extremely supportive of ASEAN's infrastructure development, and we are very grateful for that. I think as much as we want to develop infrastructure, we also have to take care of the fact that it's not going to affect our overall balance now and in the future. So the green incentive is certainly very much appreciated. But the problem in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, is not just the impact on the environment. It's how much to raise the level of income, how to create a larger middle class so that they would become a stabilizing factor in our societies. And therefore, the role of Japan, role of China, role of Korea, India, and Australia, this is ASEAN +6, are extremely important to us. For Japan in particular, every increase of $1 GDP in ASEAN countries, it will reflect to 6 cents of export from Japan to our 10 economies. That's a large percentage. China is enjoying trade favor with us, favorable balance with us to the tune of $30 billion a year. And growth is 30% a year with ASEAN, 192 billion in 2008. You can imagine how big it's going to be in the future. But with all these major economies in East Asia, we are now having the FTAs in place. We have to fine-tune them. We have to make sure that it's going to work for the benefit of both sides. We have to make sure that we are not going to be a dumping grounds for cheap products. So we are working on all those things, including maintaining our balance in the environment. But all these countries in East Asia are working together with resources, with expertise, and with ideas, and with incentives, just like being mentioned by the representative of JBIC.
Concern. Thank you very much. Just wanted to ask Andrei Kostin just about the banking sector. It's a broad question. What stage of development is the banking sector? And I'm curious to know, having watched the global financial crisis and the implosion of Wall Street and the developed financial system taken to the brink, have banks in Asia seen that and said, we will now not follow that sort of path? Do they run the risk of actually turning their back on the better parts of international finance because they have seen what happened when the worst excesses were allowed to get away?
I don't think so. I think it is true, though, that the level of crisis for this or that financial markets in specific countries very much dependent on the openness of these markets to the world markets. Because those markets who were exposed more, they suffered more. Those who were more closed, during this crisis, they probably benefited. But in the long run, of course, that will not lead those markets to big development. So I think there's no other way for any financial markets in order to succeed as to liberalize the markets and to play part of this in this international financial market. So I think that's the way which each country will move anyway if they want to, this or that country wants to achieve success, and including the issues which the Prime Minister mentioned about bringing investment to infrastructure, to other projects in the country. I think the openness is very much important. On the other hand, I think we all have to learn some lessons from this crisis. Of course, one of my friends said that because of such crises happens every 90 years, we should forget about lessons because probably those who are sitting here will not survive to the next crisis. But I think from the point of view of the mankind, that would not be a very good approach. So we all take lessons from this, though even if we look at how the international community is drafting the proposals, I think it still will be a very difficult task to agree on any measures within G20 or any other mechanism. We now definitely see how certain countries, particularly in the United States, is taking some measures on investment banking side, but and I think they're quite right. But I don't expect actually that there will be some common decisions which will probably, because again, there's a very different problems for different financial markets.
So we're not going to have a global solution?
I don't think so. I don't think probably it is necessary. But for those markets now who knows where they're planning to develop, I mentioned, for example, that most of the local markets don't have any derivatives at all, with the exception maybe of Hong Kong and Singapore and Tokyo. All the other, they don't have at all. In Russia as well, by the way. So we'll probably keep it in mind when we're developing our markets about what mistakes the markets our predecessors had, but I don't expect a global solution. So, I mean, my answer is that the market will develop the same. You can't stop this process. You can't exclude derivatives from the local markets. You can't exclude many things. Better regulations, that is necessary. I mean, to impose regulations on the areas which were not part of regulations, prop trading and other, that's the way to do. But I think in the long run, more liberalized and more common market in financial sector is vital for development of Asia as well.
All right, we are going to have to wrap this up. I just want to finish up with a question to the Prime Minister. And it was something, I want to go back to what Surin said right at the start of this, about how when ASEAN goes to the G20, you want to show the confidence of what ASEAN is now achieving and tell the ASEAN story in a way. My question to you, Prime Minister, as the chair of ASEAN, what do you want to hear from the G20? What do you want from them to help get over this global financial crisis, to get sustainable development?
Tôi với tư cách là Chủ tịch ASEAN, tôi rất là hân hạnh là thay mặt ASEAN dự hội nghị G20 sắp tới ở Canada. Mong muốn của tôi cũng như các nước thành viên ASEAN để biết rằng, để hiểu rằng các nước G20 cũng như nền kinh tế thế giới này đã sẽ cơ cấu lại như thế nào để phục hồi nhanh hơn, cân bằng, bền vững hơn, xanh hơn, hiệu quả hơn. đó là cái mong muốn của chúng tôi được lắng nghe và về cái sự phát triển, về cái sự phục hồi cũng như là cái việc mà chuyển đổi mô hình tăng trưởng, mô hình phát triển hiệu quả bền vững hơn. Thứ hai là chúng tôi muốn nói lên một cái tiếng nói là cái quản trị cái nền kinh tế toàn cầu phải được đó là dân chủ hơn, công bằng hơn, và các nước đang phát triển sẽ có vai trò ngày càng lớn hơn vào cái quản trị nền kinh tế toàn cầu. Và ASEAN chúng tôi cũng mong muốn là sẽ có một cái tiếng nói có trách nhiệm xây dựng trong cái sự phát triển của cộng đồng quốc tế, để chúng ta trên thế giới này, cái nền kinh tế thế giới có một cái sự phát triển bền vững, cân bằng hơn, và cái vai trò của các nước đang phát triển sẽ được có cái vai trò và vị trí phù hợp hơn, thích hợp hơn đối với cái sự phát triển của nền kinh tế thế giới cũng như cái quản trị tài chính toàn cầu.
Right, Prime Minister, thank you very much. And on that note, we will be, of course, following the G20, obviously very closely, all of us. Our time has run out. I'd just like to say again, thank you to our guests, Hemant, Nerurkar, Andrei, Kostin, Surin, Pitsuwan, and the Prime Minister. Thanks again. Thank you for joining us.